U.S. Delta Force laughed at the old man with the rifle until they saw the engraving on the barrel. Sometimes the most dangerous assumptions are made about the quietest people. This is the story of how a simple security dispute at a retirement home unleashed secrets that had been buried for over 50 years and revealed that some legends never truly die. They just wait patiently in rocking chairs until the world needs reminding of what real courage looks like. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Tranquil Pines retirement community as Patrick Snyder sat on his favorite wooden bench, a weathered rifle laid carefully across his knees. His 83-year-old hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this same ritual thousands of times before, running a clean cloth along the barrel with movements that seemed almost meditative in their calm repetition. To the casual observer, Patrick appeared to be exactly what he seemed, an elderly man maintaining what was probably his hunting rifle, perhaps reliving memories of better days when his joints didn't ache and his eyes didn't require reading glasses. The weapon itself looked ancient, its wooden stock worn smooth by decades of handling, its metal surfaces showing the patina that comes only from age and careful maintenance. But there was something about Patrick's concentration, about the reverence with which he handled the rifle, that suggested this was more than simple maintenance. Each movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he were performing a sacred duty rather than routine cleaning. His fingers traced along engravings in the metal that were too small and faded for anyone else to read, but which clearly held profound meaning for him. "Haven't fired this old girl in over 50 years. Patrick murmured to himself, his voice carrying the soft cadence of someone lost in memory. But she still deserves proper care. The peaceful atmosphere of the courtyard was suddenly disrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps on the paved walkway, as two security guards approached with the purposeful stride of men who had identified a potential problem that required their attention. Mark Thompson, the younger of the two guards, was 28 years old, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having been truly tested. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his equipment arranged with military precision, despite having never served in any branch of the armed forces. He compensated for his lack of actual authority with an excess of attitude, treating his job at the retirement home as if he were protecting national security, rather than ensuring that elderly residents followed basic safety protocols. Dave Martinez, his partner, was 15 years older and carried himself with the weary patience of someone who had learned that most problems could be solved with conversation rather than confrontation. He had worked security for over 2 decades, long enough to understand that diffusing situations was usually more effective than escalating them, but also experienced enough to recognize when his younger partner was about to create unnecessary drama. "Excuse me, sir," Mark announced as they reached Patrick's bench, his voice carrying the kind of official authority that he had practiced in front of mirrors. "I'm going to need you to surrender that weapon immediately. Firearms are not permitted in common areas of this facility." Patrick looked up from his cleaning with the mild expression of someone who had been interrupted during a quiet moment, but wasn't particularly concerned about the interruption. His pale blue eyes held the calm steadiness of someone who had faced far more serious challenges than overzealous security guards. "Good afternoon, boys," Patrick replied politely, his voice carrying the courteous tone that he used with everyone at the facility, regardless of how they treated him. "Beautiful day for sitting outside, isn't it?" Mark's jaw tightened with frustration at what he perceived as deliberate non-compliance disguised as friendly conversation. In his experience, people who didn't immediately follow his instructions were usually trying to establish dominance or test his authority, and he had learned to respond to such challenges with increased pressure. "Sir, I asked you to surrender the weapon. This is a direct order, not a request for small talk about the weather." Dave stepped forward slightly, recognizing the warning signs that suggested this conversation was about to escalate beyond what the situation required. What my partner means, Mr. Snyder, is that we received a complaint about someone cleaning a gun in the courtyard, and we just need to make sure everything follows facility guidelines. Patrick nodded with understanding, as if he genuinely appreciated Dave's more diplomatic approach to the situation. I can understand the concern. This rifle hasn't been fired in decades, and I only brought it out here because the light is better for proper cleaning. Would you prefer that I take it back to my room? What I'd prefer, Mark interrupted, his voice rising with the kind of aggressive authority that he believed demonstrated professional competence, is for you to hand over that weapon right now before I have to call this in as a security incident. The threat seemed to amuse Patrick rather than concern him, and he continued his methodical cleaning while speaking in the same calm tone he had maintained throughout the conversation. Son, this rifle is probably older than you are, and it's no more dangerous than the walking canes that half the residents use to get around. But if it makes you feel better, I'm happy to put it away. Mark's face reddened as he interpreted Patrick's reasonable response as condescension and mockery of his authority. In his mind, the elderly man was deliberately undermining his position in front of his partner and any other residents who might be watching the interaction. I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation, old man. I have the authority to confiscate any weapon that poses a potential threat to facility security, and your attitude is making me think that you might not have the judgment necessary to safely possess firearms. Dave placed a restraining hand on Mark's arm, recognizing that his partner was allowing his ego to transform a simple policy enforcement issue into a personal confrontation that could easily spiral out of control. Mark, let's just... No, Dave. This guy thinks he can ignore facility rules because he's old and we'll feel sorry for him. Well, I've got news for him. Rules apply to everyone and respect for authority isn't optional. Patrick set down his cleaning cloth and looked directly at Mark for the first time since the conversation had begun. There was something different in his expression now, a subtle shift that suggested the mild-mannered retiree was capable of becoming something else entirely if the situation required it. Young man, Patrick said quietly, his voice taking on a quality that made both guards pay attention despite themselves. I've been following rules and respecting authority since before you were born. I came out here to maintain something that has great personal meaning to me, and I've been nothing but polite and cooperative since you approached me. Mark felt something unsettling in Patrick's steady gaze, a sense that he was being evaluated by someone whose opinion mattered more than he had initially realized. But rather than backing down, he chose to interpret his discomfort as evidence that the old man was trying to intimidate him. Personal meaning doesn't override security protocols, Mark replied, reaching for Patrick's wallet that was sitting on the bench beside the rifle. I'm going to need to see some identification and documentation for this weapon. As Mark grabbed the wallet and began rifling through its contents, Patrick's expression changed completely. The mild annoyance was replaced by something harder and more dangerous, though his voice remained perfectly controlled. I'd prefer that you didn't go through my personal belongings without permission. Mark ignored the request, pulling out a faded military patch that had been carefully preserved in one of the wallet's compartments. The insignia was unlike anything he recognized, a serpent coiled around what appeared to be an ivory spear with symbols that looked more like ancient runes than standard military markings. What's this supposed to be? Mark asked mockingly, holding up the patch for Dave to see. Some kind of fantasy gaming club? Or maybe you bought this at a surplus store to impress the nurses. It was at that moment that Mark noticed the engraving on the rifle's receiver, etched in letters so small and faded that they were barely visible unless someone was looking for them specifically. But once he saw them, the words seemed to jump out with startling clarity. Project Ivory Serpent. We who are not. The cryptic message meant nothing to Mark, but something about the way Patrick's entire demeanor had shifted suggested that these weren't just decorative markings on an old hunting rifle. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, Mark felt a flicker of uncertainty about exactly what he had stumbled into. Mark held the military patch up to the afternoon light, studying the strange insignia with the kind of smug satisfaction that came from believing he had uncovered evidence of fraud. The serpent coiled around the ivory spear looked nothing like any military unit designation he had ever seen, and the unfamiliar symbols surrounding it seemed to confirm his suspicion that Patrick was wearing honors he had never earned. "You know what this looks like to me?" Mark announced loudly enough for other residents sitting nearby to hear his accusation. "This looks like stolen valor. Some old man trying to impress people with fake military service because his real life wasn't interesting enough." Patrick's hands had stopped moving completely, the cleaning cloth frozen in his grip as he watched Mark wave the precious patch around like a piece of evidence in a criminal trial. That patch represented memories that were more sacred to him than anything else he owned. Memories of men who had died in places that didn't officially exist, during missions that had been erased from every official record. "Sir," Patrick said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that Dave immediately recognized, even if Mark remained oblivious to it. "I'm going to ask you one more time to return my property and treat it with appropriate respect." Mark laughed, the sound harsh and mocking in the peaceful courtyard setting. "Appropriate respect? For what? For some piece of costume jewelry that you probably ordered online? I've dealt with plenty of wannabes like you, old man. You think because you're in a retirement home, people will automatically assume you're some kind of war hero." Dave stepped closer to his partner, his instincts warning him that they were approaching dangerous territory. He had worked with enough genuine veterans to recognize the signs of someone whose military service had been significant and traumatic, and Patrick's controlled stillness suggested depths that Mark was too inexperienced to perceive. "Mark, maybe we should just—" "No, Dave. I'm tired of these old frauds thinking they can manipulate us with fake military credentials. This guy probably never served a day in his life, and now he's sitting here playing soldier with props he bought at a costume shop." Mark reached out and placed his hand on the rifle's barrel, not to confiscate it, but to make a point about his authority over the situation. The moment his fingers made contact with the weapon, Patrick's reaction was immediate and startling. "Don't touch that rifle." The words came out with such quiet intensity that several nearby residents looked up from their conversations, sensing that the atmosphere in the courtyard had suddenly changed. Patrick's voice carried undertones that suggested barely controlled violence, though his physical position hadn't changed at all. Mark, however, interpreted Patrick's reaction as proof that he had successfully established dominance over the situation. "Or what, Grandpa? You going to report me to the nursing home administration? Maybe call your family to complain about the mean security guard?" But as Mark continued his mocking performance, something was happening to Patrick that neither guard could see or understand. The touch of unauthorized hands on his rifle had triggered memories that had been carefully buried for over 50 years, memories of jungle warfare and classified operations that officially had never occurred. Suddenly, Patrick wasn't sitting in a retirement home courtyard anymore. He was back in the humid darkness of a Vietnamese jungle, listening to his teammate Miller screaming for help as enemy forces closed in around their position. He could smell the cordite and blood, could feel the weight of equipment and the desperate urgency of a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. Miller's hit. The voice echoed in Patrick's memory with the clarity of something that had happened yesterday, rather than decades ago. "We need extraction now." Patrick's grip on the cleaning cloth tightened as the flashback continued, his mind reliving the moment when he had made the decision that would define the rest of his military career. The choice between following orders to abandon a wounded teammate and risking everything to save a man whose family would never know how he had really died. "Sir? Sir? Are you all right?" Dave's voice seemed to come from very far away, pulling Patrick back from the jungle memories to the present reality of the retirement home courtyard. But the transition wasn't smooth. For a moment, Patrick looked at Mark with eyes that saw not an overzealous security guard, but a potential threat to mission security. Mark, oblivious to what was happening, chose that moment to escalate his harassment even further. "Look at this guy, Dave. Probably having some kind of senior moment because he got caught lying about his military service. Maybe we should call the facility nurses to check his medication." The casual cruelty of the comment seemed to flip a switch in Patrick's consciousness. Without warning, his left hand shot out and grabbed Mark's wrist with a grip that was shockingly strong for an 83-year-old man. The security guard found himself unable to pull free, held in place by fingers that felt like they were made of steel cable. "I said don't touch the rifle," Patrick repeated, his voice now carrying undertones that made Dave reach reflexively for his radio. This was no longer a simple policy enforcement issue. Something fundamental had changed in the dynamics of the situation, and Dave had enough experience to recognize when things were about to go very wrong very quickly. Mark's face went pale as he realized that his assumptions about Patrick's physical capabilities had been dangerously incorrect. The old man's grip was not just strong, it was precisely applied with the kind of knowledge that suggested extensive training in hand-to-hand combat techniques. "Let go of me right now, or I'm calling the police," Mark managed to say, though his voice carried none of the confidence that had characterized his earlier threats. Patrick held the grip for another few seconds, his eyes boring into Mark's with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into the younger man's soul. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the moment passed. Patrick released Mark's wrist and returned his attention to his rifle cleaning as if nothing had happened. But something had definitely happened, and everyone in the immediate vicinity could feel it. The peaceful retirement home courtyard had become charged with tension, and several residents had begun moving toward the building as their instincts warned them to avoid whatever was developing around Patrick's bench. It was at that moment that Sarah Jenkins happened to walk through the courtyard on her way to visit her grandfather, who lived in the facility's assisted living wing. Sarah was 32 years old, a nurse practitioner whose father had served 3 tours in Iraq before retiring from the military with commendations that he never discussed in detail. What Sarah saw was a scene that immediately triggered her protective instincts. 2 security guards harassing an elderly veteran who was obviously trying to maintain his dignity in the face of deliberate provocation. She had grown up around military personnel and recognized the signs of someone whose service had been significant enough to leave permanent marks on their character. More importantly, Sarah noticed details that the security guards had missed. The way Patrick held himself, the precision of his movements, the quality of the rifle he was cleaning. These weren't the characteristics of someone playing dress-up with military memorabilia. This was a genuine veteran being disrespected by people who had no understanding of what they were dealing with. As Sarah reached for her cell phone, she made a decision that would transform this local confrontation into something with national security implications. Instead of calling 911 or facility management, she dialed a number that connected directly to her father's former commanding officer at Fort Bragg. A man who had told her to call if she ever encountered a situation involving veteran affairs that seemed to require immediate military attention. Sarah Jenkins pressed the speed dial number that her father had programmed into her phone 2 years earlier, with strict instructions. Only use this if you encounter a veteran in serious trouble, and civilian authorities won't be enough to handle it. Colonel James Matson had been her father's commanding officer during his deployments to Iraq, and he had maintained contact with military families even after retirement, understanding that sometimes the bonds forged in combat extended beyond active duty service. The phone rang twice before a crisp military voice answered. "Colonel Matson, Fort Bragg Operations." "Colonel, this is Sarah Jenkins, Tom Jenkins' daughter. You told me to call if I ever encountered a situation involving veteran affairs that needed immediate military attention." "Sarah, I remember you. What's your current situation?" Sarah quickly explained what she was witnessing. Two security guards harassing an elderly veteran, confiscating his personal military memorabilia, and showing complete disrespect for someone who appeared to be a decorated service member. As she spoke, she could hear Colonel Matson typing rapidly on a computer keyboard. "Sarah, I need you to get as close as you can to this veteran and tell me his name, along with any details you can see about his military insignia or equipment." Sarah moved closer to Patrick's bench, pretending to check her phone while actually observing the confrontation more carefully. She could see that Mark was still holding Patrick's military patch and examining the rifle with obvious skepticism about its authenticity. "His name is Patrick Snyder, and he appears to be in his 80s. The security guard is holding what looks like a military unit patch with a serpent wrapped around something that might be a spear. There are symbols on it that I don't recognize." Colonel Matson's typing stopped abruptly. "Sarah, I need you to look at the rifle very carefully. Are there any engravings or markings on the metal parts?" Sarah squinted at the weapon, trying to make out details from her position several feet away. "I can see something engraved on the receiver, but it's small and faded. It looks like it might say, 'Project' something, and then words I can't make out clearly." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Colonel Matson finally spoke again, his voice carried an urgency that made Sarah's heart rate increase. "Sarah, can you make out any part of what follows the word 'project'? Any letters or words at all?" Sarah moved as close as she dared without drawing attention from the security guards. "I think I can see ivory and maybe serpent." "Colonel, what is this about? You sound like—" "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. Under no circumstances should you let those security guards remove Patrick Snyder from that location. I don't care what you have to do. Call facility management, fake a medical emergency, anything. But keep him exactly where he is until military personnel arrive." "Military personnel?" "Colonel, this is just a retirement home dispute about facility policies. Why would—" "Sarah, I can't explain the details over an unsecured line, but if this is who I think it is, those security guards are harassing someone whose service record is so classified that most current military personnel don't even know he exists. I'm contacting General Pierce immediately." The call ended, leaving Sarah staring at her phone while trying to process what she had just heard. Colonel Matson had described Patrick as if he were some kind of military legend whose very existence was a state secret, which seemed impossible given that he was sitting peacefully in a retirement home cleaning an old rifle. But as Sarah looked more carefully at the elderly veteran, she began noticing details that supported Colonel Matson's reaction. Patrick's posture, despite his age, carried the unmistakable bearing of someone who had held significant military authority. His movements, even while performing the simple task of weapon maintenance, showed the kind of precision that came from decades of military discipline. Most telling of all was Patrick's reaction to the security guard's harassment. Rather than becoming defensive or argumentative, he had maintained the kind of calm control that suggested someone accustomed to dealing with far more serious threats than overzealous facility security. 300 miles away at Fort Bragg, Colonel Matson was already on a secure line to General Alan Pierce, commander of Special Operations Forces, and one of the few officers with sufficient clearance to access the archived records of Project Ivory Serpent. "General, I have reason to believe that Patrick Snyder, a resident at Tranquil Pines Retirement Community, is a surviving member of Project Ivory Serpent. He's currently being harassed by civilian security personnel who have no understanding of his service record." General Pierce's reaction was immediate and decisive. "Colonel, are you certain of this identification? Ivory Serpent personnel were officially declared killed in action over 50 years ago. The description matches archived intelligence photos, and the witness reports seeing the project designation engraved on what appears to be an original issue rifle. General, if this is who we think it is, we're dealing with one of the founding members of modern special operations doctrine." General Pierce was already reaching for his emergency communication system as he processed the implications. Project Ivory Serpent had been so highly classified that its very existence had been denied by multiple administrations, and its surviving members had been declared officially dead to protect operational security that remained sensitive even decades later. "I'm deploying immediate response assets to that location," General Pierce told Colonel Madsen. "No one with knowledge of Ivory Serpent operations can be allowed to face disrespect from civilian personnel who don't understand what they're dealing with." As emergency protocols activated and military assets began mobilizing for what appeared to be a routine retirement home dispute, none of the participants could have imagined that they were about to witness the most significant military recognition ceremony in modern history, one that would finally honor heroes whose service had been too classified to acknowledge until now. The sound of approaching helicopters began as a distant vibration before building into the unmistakable rhythm of military aircraft moving with urgent purpose. 2 black helicopters without identification markings appeared over the tree line, approaching Tranquil Pines with obvious intent. Mark felt his confidence wavering as he realized their security dispute had attracted military attention. The helicopter's aggressive approach suggested whoever was aboard considered this an emergency requiring immediate intervention. The aircraft touched down in the parking lot, rotors creating windstorms that forced everyone to shield their eyes. General Alan Pierce emerged with a ceremonial honor guard, striding directly toward Patrick's bench while ignoring the security guards entirely. When Pierce reached the bench, he came to perfect attention and rendered a precise salute that transformed the mundane courtyard into hallowed ground. Patrick returned the salute with movements carrying decades of military training despite his age. "Sergeant Major Snyder," Pierce said formally, "it is an honor to finally meet you, sir." The use of Patrick's military title shocked the crowd, particularly Mark and Dave, who had assumed they were dealing with a civilian retiree. Pierce addressed the broader audience. "You are in the presence of Sergeant Major Patrick Snyder, founding member of Project Ivory Serpent, the most classified special operations unit in American military history." Pierce continued his revelations. "Ivory Serpent operated during the Cold War, conducting missions that officially never occurred. The 12-man team prevented international conflicts that could have escalated into nuclear warfare." He gestured toward the rifle. "That weapon is one of 6 specially manufactured rifles issued to Ivory Serpent personnel. The engravings carry the highest national security classification." Addressing Mark directly, Pierce's voice hardened. "The patch you confiscated is the insignia of men who volunteered for missions with survival rates below 30%. We who are not refers to their official non-existent status." Pierce stepped closer to Mark. "You have harassed a Medal of Honor recipient whose service to this country is immeasurable. Your behavior has been harmful to a veteran who deserves nothing but respect." Patrick demonstrated the rifle's field stripping with speed that revealed extensive tactical training. "This rifle represents 11 men who died protecting secrets still too sensitive to discuss. I maintain it as a memorial to brothers who gave everything for unrecorded missions." Everyone present understood they had witnessed the revelation of a genuine legend who had lived anonymously among them, carrying memories of heroic service that shaped military history. The revelation transformed Tranquil Pines into something resembling a military shrine, with residents approaching Patrick with newfound reverence. The quiet man cleaning his rifle was now revealed as a figure whose service had shaped American national security in undisclosed ways. Mark stood surrounded by witnesses to his humiliation, struggling to process how completely he had misjudged the situation. General Pierce approached with measured steps to deliver lasting consequences. "Mr. Thompson, your behavior demonstrates fundamental failure to understand respect due to military veterans. Your employment will be terminated immediately, and your treatment of Sergeant Major Snyder will be documented throughout any future security career." Mark's face went pale, realizing his aggressive posturing had destroyed both his job and professional reputation within industries valuing military service respect. Dave received a transfer with formal reprimand, acknowledging both his restraint and inadequate response to his partner's misconduct. The most remarkable moment came when Patrick approached the officials, determining Mark's fate. The elderly veteran moved with dignity, earned through far more serious challenges. "General Pierce," Patrick said quietly, "I'd like to say something about this young man's behavior." Patrick looked directly at Mark. "This young man made serious mistakes that caused me distress, but I believe his behavior came from ignorance rather than malice. He's young, inexperienced, and probably trying to demonstrate authority inappropriately." Mark looked up with surprise, not expecting forgiveness from someone he had humiliated. "I've known many young soldiers who started by confusing aggression with strength. The measure of a person isn't making errors, but learning from them and becoming better." Patrick requested education rather than punishment. Help him understand what military service means, what veterans sacrifice, and how to show appropriate respect. 6 months later, Mark sat across from Patrick in the same courtyard, no longer in uniform, but wearing civilian clothes of someone whose career had been redirected. "Mr. Snyder," Mark began humbly, "I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance to learn from my mistakes instead of ending my career." Patrick saw genuine humility where arrogance once existed. Mark explained he now worked with veterans advocacy, helping navigate benefits and healthcare bureaucracy after receiving extensive military history education. Their encounter had come full circle, from confrontation to education to mutual respect. Mark learned that strength appeared as quiet dignity, genuine heroes rarely sought recognition, and the most important virtue was compassion for those who served. Patrick demonstrated that military values extended beyond combat, showing that brotherhood forged in classified operations could inspire mercy toward those who failed to recognize such sacrifices. Their story became part of training programs for security personnel at military facilities, ensuring future guards would understand respect due to veterans whose service might not be immediately apparent, but remained significant in its quiet dignity.